Hello and welcome to Echoes of the Past, the podcast where we dive deep into the currents of history that have shaped our modern world. I'm Alexa.
And I'm Sam. Today, we're setting sail on a truly epic journey. We're going to be talking about a historical narrative that, for a long time, was often relegated to a footnote in Western-centric history books, but which is now being recognized for its monumental importance.
That's right. We're exploring the idea of ancient India not as a secluded, mystical land, but as a dynamic, outward-looking civilization, a cultural superpower whose ideas, art, and innovations radiated across Asia and beyond, fundamentally shaping the development of human civilization for over 1,000 years.
The catalyst for this discussion is historian William Dalrymple's brilliant work, The Golden Road. He uses this term not for the overland Silk Road, but for a vast network of maritime trade routes that connected India to the world. And he argues that along these routes traveled not just spices and silk, but the very building blocks of culture.
So, over the next hour or so, we're going to unpack this concept of the Indosphere. We'll talk about the great University of Nalanda, a beacon of learning that attracted minds from all over Asia. We'll see how Sanskrit became the Latin of the East. We'll follow the paths of Buddhism and Hinduism as they transformed societies from Afghanistan to Indonesia.
We'll give credit where it's due. For the invention of zero and our modern number system, a development so crucial it underpins everything from architecture to the digital age. And we'll marvel at the breathtaking art of the Ajanta caves, which offers us a window into a surprisingly cosmopolitan ancient world.
So, Sam, let's start by setting the scene. When we say ancient India in this context, what time frame are we really talking about? And what was the world like then?
It's a great question, Alexa. Dalrymple places the peak of this cultural export from around 500 BCE to about 1200 CE. That's a span of nearly 2,000 years. To put that in perspective, this period begins with the life of the Buddha and the Achaemenid Persian Empire, runs concurrent with the height of classical Greece and the Roman Empire, continues through the rise of Islam, and only really begins to wane around the time of the Crusades in Europe.
So while Europe was going through its own dramatic cycles of rise and fall, and while the great Chinese dynasties were flourishing, the Indian subcontinent was in a sustained period of incredible intellectual, artistic, and economic fertility. It wasn't a monolithic empire for most of this time. It was often a collection of powerful kingdoms, but they shared a common cultural and linguistic bedrock that proved incredibly resilient and attractive.
Exactly. And the key mechanism for spreading this culture was trade, but not the Silk Road we all know from the history books. Dalrymple makes a provocative and I think very convincing case that for much of antiquity, the sea routes were far more significant in terms of volume, reliability, and cultural impact than the overland routes.
Hence, the Golden Road. Imagine the Indian Ocean not as a barrier, but as a highway. The key to unlocking it was the monsoon. For 6 months of the year, the winds blow steadily from the southwest, and for the other 6, from the northeast. Ancient sailors learned to harness these winds. A merchant could set sail from the Red Sea or the Persian Gulf, catch the southwest monsoon, and be carried directly to the Malabar coast of India in a matter of weeks.
After wintering in India, waiting for the winds to change, they could then catch the northeast monsoon to continue their journey to Southeast Asia, or return west with holds full of priceless cargo. This created a predictable annual rhythm of trade that connected entire civilizations. Ports like Maziris on the Kerala coast became legendary international emporiums, places where Romans, Greeks, Arabs, Jews, Ethiopians, and Chinese merchants all rubbed shoulders.
And this is a crucial point. This wasn't a one-way street of Indian influence. The ports were melting pots. Ideas flowed in all directions. But the argument is that the cultural output flowing from India was so rich, so sophisticated, and adaptable that it was eagerly adopted and adapted by the emerging kingdoms of Southeast Asia and deeply respected by traders from the West.
The Roman naturalist Pliny the Elder famously complained about the drain of Roman gold to India to pay for pepper, pearls, and silks. He estimated that India was draining the Roman Empire of 50 million sesterces every year, a staggering sum. This gives us an idea of the sheer economic pull of India, but what's even more fascinating is what else was being traded alongside those material goods.
Let's dive into one of the most tangible exports, language. Sam, tell us about the journey of Sanskrit.
With pleasure. Sanskrit is a member of the Indo-European language family, which means it's distantly related to Greek, Latin, and English. But around the 4th century BCE, a scholar named Panini composed what is arguably the most sophisticated grammar ever written, the Ashtadhyayi. This effectively standardized Sanskrit, turning it into a precise, flexible, and incredibly powerful tool for literature, science, and philosophy.
It became the language of court, of religion, of high culture, much like Latin in medieval Europe. But unlike Latin, which spread largely through Roman conquest, Sanskrit spread primarily through prestige and cultural soft power. There were no Indian legions marching into Cambodia or Java. Instead, local rulers saw the advantage of adopting the trappings of this advanced civilization.
Precisely. To be a king in 7th century Cambodia, you didn't just speak climb. You had to know Sanskrit. Inscriptions from all over Southeast Asia are bilingual. They begin with long, poetic eulogies to the king in perfect Sanskrit, invoking Hindu gods, and then switch to the local language for the practical administrative details. It was a way of legitimizing your rule, of placing yourself within a grand cosmopolitan world order.
We see the evidence everywhere. The name Singapore comes from the Sanskrit Singapura, meaning lion city. Java may derive from the Sanskrit word for barley. Thailand's old capital, Ayutthaya, is named after the legendary Indian city of Ayodhya from the Ramayana. This isn't superficial borrowing, it's evidence of a deep, foundational influence. And with the language came the stories. The great Indian epics, the Ramayana and the Mahabharata, became the shared cultural property of all of Southeast Asia. You can see performances of the Ramayana in traditional Thai dance, in Balinese shadow puppet theater, and in Cambodian ballet. The stories were localized. The monkey god Hanuman might be depicted in a Thai style, but the core narrative is unmistakably Indian.
This leads us perfectly into the religious exports. The Ramayana is, of course, a Hindu epic. So let's talk about the spread of Hinduism and Buddhism. They're often grouped together, but their paths of dissemination were quite different, weren't they?
They were. Let's start with Buddhism, as it was arguably the first to travel widely. It emerged in the 5th century BCE, a time of immense social change and philosophical debate in India. The Buddhist teachings offered a practical, accessible path to spiritual liberation that was less concerned with ritual and caste than the Vedic religion of the time.
And its early spread was greatly aided by one of India's greatest emperors, Ashoka, of the Mauryan dynasty in the 3rd century BCE. After a bloody conquest, Ashoka was remorseful and converted to Buddhism. He then embarked on a remarkable campaign of conquests by Dharma. He sent Buddhist missionaries not just throughout India, but to Sri Lanka and as far west as the Hellenistic kingdoms in Greece and Egypt.
Those edicts he carved on pillars and rocks across the subcontinent are some of the earliest decipherable written records we have from India. But the more sustained spread happened along our Golden Road. Buddhist monks traveled as passengers on merchant ships. Where the traders established trading posts, the monks established monasteries. These monasteries became centers of learning and hospitality for subsequent travelers, creating a kind of spiritual network along the trade routes.
And a fantastic example of this is the journey of the Chinese monk Faxian in the early 5th century CE. He traveled overland to India, spent years studying at Buddhist centers, and then returned to China by sea, carrying with him a trove of sacred texts and statues. His account is an invaluable record of both the journey and the state of Buddhism in India at the time.
And then there's the most famous pilgrim of all, Xuanzang in the 7th century. His journey, later fictionalized in the classic Journey to the West, is the stuff of legend. He traveled for 17 years, studied at the Great Nalanda University, which we'll get to, and returned to China with hundreds of Sanskrit texts, which he then spent the rest of his life translating. His work fundamentally shaped East Asian Buddhism.
So Buddhism spread through a combination of royal patronage, missionary activity, and symbiotic relationship with trade. Hinduism spread, particularly to Southeast Asia, was different. There were no great Hindu missionaries analogous to Buddhist monks. So how did it happen?
It was a more organic, top-down process. Indian merchants, often called Brahmins in inscriptions, though they may not all have been priests, settled in Southeast Asian port cities. They were learned, they understood astrology, statecraft, and law, the necessary skills for running a kingdom. Local chieftains seeking to consolidate their power would invite these Brahmins to their courts as advisors.
It's a fascinating model. The Brahmin would perform ritual to legitimize the king's rule, often identifying him with a Hindu god like Shiva or Vishnu. They would introduce Sanskrit as the language of administration and help draft legal codes based on Indian models. The local ruler, in turn, would adopt the title Maharaja and begin building temples in the Indian style. It was a mutually beneficial exchange that led to the Indianization of these societies without military conquest.
The physical evidence of this is absolutely breathtaking. The temple complexes of Angkor Wat in Cambodia, originally dedicated to Vishnu, are the largest religious monuments in the world. Borobudur in Java is a massive Buddhist stupa that resembles a cosmic mandala. Pramandan, also in Java, is a spectacular cluster of Hindu temples dedicated to Shiva. These are not faint echoes. They are direct and magnificent translations of Indian religious architecture and cosmology into a local idiom.
It's impossible to overstate the scale. Walking through Angkor Wat, you are surrounded by bas-reliefs depicting scenes from the Ramayana and Mahabharata. It feels like an Indian epic carved into a Cambodian mountain. This is the Indosphere made stone.
Now, all of this religious and literary culture needed institutions to sustain and develop it. And this brings us to the most astonishing institution of the ancient world, the University of Nalanda. Alexa, this place was something else.
It really was. We throw around the word university today, but Nalanda was a university in the truest sense and on a scale that is hard to comprehend. It was founded in the 5th century CE in the kingdom of Magadha in modern-day Bihar, and it flourished for over 700 years before its tragic destruction in the 12th century.
The campus was immense. Archaeological evidence and accounts from pilgrims like Xuanzang describe a vast complex of meditation halls, classrooms, libraries, and dormitories, all surrounded by a high wall. Xuanzang claims it housed 10,000 students and 2,000 teachers. It was essentially an intellectual city.
And its curriculum was staggeringly broad. Yes, it was a Mahayana Buddhist institution at its core, but the education was encyclopedic. Students studied grammar, logic, astronomy, medicine, metaphysics, and even the fine arts. They studied not just Buddhist texts, but the Vedas and philosophies like Samkhya. It was a center for debate and intellectual cross-pollination.
What's really striking is its international character. Nalanda attracted scholars from every corner of Asia. Xuanzang came from China and spent years there. Another Chinese pilgrim, Yiqing, spent a decade studying. There were scholars from Korea, Java, Sumatra, Tibet, and Central Asia. It was a veritable United Nations of ancient learning.
And its libraries were legendary. They were housed in massive multi-story buildings with evocative names like Dharma Ganj or Ocean of Truth. It's said that when the library was finally destroyed, it burned for months. The loss to human knowledge is incalculable. Nalanda was the great clearinghouse for the ideas that would then flow out along the Golden Road. A text written in the Landa could, within a generation or two, be studied in a monastery in China or a court in Indonesia.
It's a powerful reminder that the pursuit of knowledge for its own sake is a universal human impulse. But some of the knowledge generated in India had incredibly practical, world-changing consequences. We're talking, of course, about mathematics.
This is perhaps India's greatest and under-acknowledged contribution to global civilization. We all use the fruits of it every single day. I'm talking about the number system we take for granted. 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9.
We call them Arabic numerals, and that's partially correct. The Arabs were the crucial intermediaries who transmitted them to Europe. But the Arabs themselves called them Hind numerals, acknowledging their Indian origin. The breakthrough that happened in India, likely between the 5th and 7th centuries CE, was threefold.
First, the place value system. This is the idea that the value of a digit depends on its position. So in the number 105, the 1 means 100, the 0 means 0 tens, and the 5 means 5 units. This seems obvious to us, but it was revolutionary. The Romans would have written CV. Try multiplying CV by XIII using Roman numerals. It's a nightmare. With a place value system, complex calculation becomes manageable.
Second, the base 10 or decimal system, again using 10 digits. But the third and most profound breakthrough was the invention of 0 as a number in its own right, with its own properties. The concept of shunya, void, was a philosophical concept in Buddhism and Hinduism, and this may have inspired the mathematical leap. The earliest confirmed inscription of the symbol 0 that we know of is from a temple in Gwalior, India, from 876 CE, but references to it in texts go back centuries earlier. This system, with its elegance and power, was adopted by Persian and Arab scholars like al-Khwarizmi, from whose name we get the word algorithm. When it finally reached Europe in the Middle Ages, it revolutionized commerce, science, and navigation. Every time we use a computer, which operates on binary, we're using a descendant of this system. Every time we do our taxes or an engineer builds a bridge, they are relying on a conceptual tool forged in ancient India. It's impossible to imagine the modern world without it.
Now, we've talked about these grand structural exports: language, religion, mathematics. But what did the society that produced all this actually look and feel like? For that, we have an incredible time capsule, the Ajanta Caves.
The story of their rediscovery is straight out of an adventure novel. In 1819, a British officer named John Smith was on a tiger hunt in the hills of Maharashtra. He chased his prey into a narrow gorge, and as he looked up, he saw what he thought was the entrance to a cave. To get a better view, he was hoisted up by vines by his companions. What he found wasn't a natural cave, but a hand-carved Buddhist monastery and prayer hall, or chatya, dating back to the 2nd century BCE. And inside, covering the walls and ceilings, were some of the most exquisite and well-preserved ancient paintings in the world. He had accidentally stumbled upon the first of 30 caves at Ajanta. The caves were created in 2 phases over centuries. The earliest were from around 200 BCE, and the later more elaborate ones from the 5th century CE, the Gupta period, often called the Golden Age of India. What makes the paintings at Ajanta so special is their humanity.
Yes, they depict the life of the Buddha and the Jataka tales, stories of his previous lives, but they do so by placing them in a vibrant, bustling, cosmopolitan world. You don't just see serene Buddhas, you see scenes of courtly life, of princes and princesses, of merchants and musicians, of sailors and foreign ambassadors with distinctively different facial features and clothing.
The artists mastered techniques of perspective and foreshortening. They convey emotion with incredible subtlety. You see tenderness in a glance, joy in a dance, and sorrow in a farewell. The paintings are a riot of color and life. They show us that the people who created this spiritual art were fully engaged with the world. They were connected to trade, to politics, to the pleasures and pains of earthly existence.
This is the final crucial piece of the puzzle.
The Indosphere wasn't built by austere ascetics turning their backs on the world. It was built by a sophisticated society that saw no contradiction between the spiritual and the material, the sacred and the profane. The same merchants who funded the digging of these caves were getting rich from trade along the Golden Road. The art itself shows influences from Rome and Persia. You can see figures in togas and Sasanian-style crowns. Ajanta is the perfect symbol of the Golden Road, a globalized, connected, and incredibly creative world.
So, to bring our journey to a close, what happened to this Golden Road? Why did this era of immense Indian cultural influence begin to wane after the 12th century?
It was a combination of factors. In India, the destruction of Nalanda and other monastic universities by invading armies in the 12th and 13th centuries was a catastrophic blow to the institutional heart of Buddhist learning. Buddhism, in fact, virtually disappeared from the land of its birth.
And meanwhile, in Southeast Asia, the kingdoms that had so enthusiastically adopted Indian models began to develop their own unique, mature cultural identities. They had absorbed what they needed, and they started to create distinctly Thai, Khmer, and Javanese syntheses. The need to constantly look to India for validation diminished. And finally, the rise of Islam as a powerful new cultural and political force in both India and the Indian Ocean region created a new dynamic. Trade continued, of course, but the cultural flow was different. The era of the Indosphere, as Dalrymple defines it, had reached its end.
But its legacy is absolutely everywhere. It's in the numerals on this script. It's in the yoga practice in studios across the globe. It's in the Buddhist traditions of Tibet, Japan, and Sri Lanka. It's in the Hindu temples of Bali and the epic stories told in Thai dance. It's in the very linguistic DNA of Southeast Asia.
William Dalrymple's book, The Golden Road, does a magnificent job of restoring this vast chapter of history to its proper place. It reminds us that the flow of ideas has always been the true engine of human progress, and that for well over a millennium, India was a brilliant beacon, illuminating the world. It's a story of connection, not conflict, of soft power, not hard conquest. And in our often divided world, it's a history worth remembering and celebrating.
Thank you for joining us on this journey down the Golden Road.
Until next time on Echoes of the Past, don't forget subscribe, like, and share your family and friends.